Hello, this is Mark Tucker, and welcome to part 2 of creating a badge wrapper component for Alexa Presentation Language. When we left off in the last video, we had created our basic structure for our screen with a component that's a frame that's acting as the background color, and then a container that includes these controls: a regular button that works just as is, an Alexa icon button, which also has a press, a frame with a background color, and a vector graphic in the shape of a house. So that's where we're starting, and what we want to do is we want to get to the point where we can create a wrapper around these components so that they will have badges, and we can set different properties for the badges. So that's where we're going next, and I just have things scrunched down. So these are the four main components: the button, the icon button, the frame, and the vector graphic. So what we're going to do, let's go ahead and take this one as an example. What we want to be able to do when we're done is we want to go ahead and take, I think I'm going to just copy. This hasn't been created yet in our project. And this is just acting like, oh, we're adding another component here. But this is what I do sometimes. So right now these are our siblings, and we're just acting like this is just one other thing. But what we want to do is we're going to create this new component called the badge wrapper. And with the badge wrapper, I'm going to make that a little bit bigger so we can see more on the code side. So what's going to happen with the badge wrapper is that we can have set different properties. Like one of them would be what's the text that's going to show on the badge. But this is where the wrapper part comes in. We could take this vector control as is. We won't need that extra comma there. And then we can take and put it right here inside of this wrapper component. So now the badge wrapper is the parent of the vector graphic. And you notice that now it's disappeared from our document. Well, because the badge wrapper doesn't exist, and so it's trying to show a component that doesn't exist. Now, like if we were to replace this with a container, then we could see there's the container control. So all we're doing is we're going to create this badge wrapper component that doesn't exist yet. Right now we're up to about 118 lines. When we're done, we'll be less than 300 lines of code for the entire project, and less than half of that will actually be the component that we're going to create, the badge wrapper and some other stuff. So let's go ahead and figure out where we're going to start doing that. Where we're going to put controls. Eventually a control could end up in a separate file like this Alexa layout. So like the button is part of this Alexa layouts, which is really just taking the stuff that we're going to do here and then packaging up just some of that into a separate project that then we can import in. We're not going to actually do that for this example, but that's the kind of the idea, is that we're going to create a separate component that we could expose out of a library, or we could just keep in this document. The place that we create the different components is in this section called layouts. So let's go ahead and start adding in some of these things for our layouts and talk about what's going on as we do that. So we know we want to go ahead and create a button wrapper or a badge wrapper component. So that's what we're going to do. It's just a JSON object where we say we're going to give it a name, and that's going to be a component. Now our help is helpful over here because it says that you need either an item or an items property on a component. And we talked about, or we've seen how items is an array. You could technically have item be a singular child and have it be an object as opposed to an array. But we need to handle that situation, and we actually want to handle a situation where maybe the person using our wrapper is going to use item or items. And so the first thing that we want to do is we want to go ahead and define the parameters that are going to be inside of our component here. So here are the parameters, and this is just an array. So like the easiest thing to do, if we don't necessarily care about defining what data type it is that we're just going to say, here is item and items parameters, and those are the things that we can do with this control. And let's go ahead and let's keep it to that simple at this point. But what we want to do is that we then, after we define our parameters, that's kind of like what's going to get passed into our control. We're going to still have to implement an items array here. And so what we want to do is start off with, like we've done before, our good old container component, so that we have the ability to customize things. And it's going to have an items array as well. All right, so we haven't really done anything other than just keeping creating these things that have items and that are containers. But this is where things start to get interesting. So what we want to be able to do is, if the user defines the item property on the control, then we want to be able to handle that. And that's what this is saying here, is that, and this is a little bit of conditional logic, and that's what the $sign curly brace means, is that we're going to do some logic in here. And to do the logic, we're going to say when the parameter is passed in for item, and down here we look and see that's not the case because the wrapper is using items. So this isn't the case, but if we were to change this to singular and an object as opposed to an array, then this would be the case. But we're saying when there's an item, then I want you to show this type called a BadgeWrapper children. And we want to set the items property of this type to the item that got passed in. See, we're checking to see if the item is there, and now we're going to pass that item in. The reason why we have to do that, and this is kind of the magic of the wrapper control, and thanks to Alexander Martin for showing me how to do this in his button example. But the magic of that is that you always have to define a type for something. So the item, the trick here is that items is going to, or checking for item is going to handle the case for whatever control that we pass in, but we need to be able to do a conditional check on it. And so this wrapper, this children control, is really just kind of a place that says, this is a placeholder for the control that I'm actually passing in, but we're going to have to implement that so that it actually does something. And this is just a very simple component that we're going to add above this one here. So here's the BadgeWrapper, and we're going to add this BadgeWrapper children. So kind of the magic of this is that it only accepts one property and items. So we've kind of consolidated item or items here, we will in just a second anyway, into an items. And that's what we're passing at the child, and we're saying that the container is going to contain an items, which is just whatever we've passed in. So this is finally where whatever it is that we're passing gets hosted, and that's going to get wrapped by this container, which is kind of wrapped by this child, and then that child is actually contained inside of this container here, which is inside of the BadgeWrapper. So that's kind of how everything's layered inside of there, but it's still not showing up. And the reason why it's not showing up is because, remember, we implemented just the case when there's an item, and down here we have items defined, right? Items. So let's figure out what we need to do in this case, and that's going to be a second when clause. So we're going to go ahead and check on this. It's going to be very similar to the one we just did, except for now it's going to check, say, when there's items being passed in, which we have, and items is going to be this vector control that now is showing up. Then we're going to say that we want to go ahead and call this BadgeWrapper children component passing in the items. So that's the vector getting passed in. Up here, we've got the items, so now we've got this container that is going to then be the vector finally. And that's why it shows up, because we finally have all those things layered up. So that's just the very basic skeleton. And so now anything that we add on to this after this point is going to be the badge part. So this is the wrapper part. And so in part 3, we're going to start adding properties to the, to create the badge and anything that's needed to configure the badge. So that's going to be continued in our next one.